Okay, I'm going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. As you've probably guessed, this is the Build Your Own Technology Radar talk. This is very much an example of unintended consequences because we never meant to create this kind of radar metaphor, and then we never actually meant for it to be used as a tool for you, but here we are. So I'm going to talk about three different radars in this talk. The first one is the metaphorical inspiration for the other two. So the first one is the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar, which is a document that my company puts out twice a year. And I'll explain where this came from and what this is in case you don't know what it is. That then is the metaphorical inspiration for two radars that you can build for yourself. One of those radars is for yourself as a career guidance tool to help you navigate the technology landscape. And the other is a radar that you can build for your company. Particularly for large enterprises, there's quite often a broken feedback loop between the people who touch technology on an everyday basis and the people who make decisions about the technology that gets touched on an everyday basis. This allows you to create a much better realistic picture of the way that you consume technology within an organization and organize it in a way that you can actually act on it from an enterprise standpoint. So that's the three radars. Let's first talk about the inspiration for this, which is the ThoughtWorks Technology Radar. Has anyone here seen one of these documents at any point? A few people have seen this. So this is a white paper and interactive website that we produce twice a year from ThoughtWorks. And it looks like this. This is the main metaphor, and this is the first page of our radar. We are consultants, so we feel compelled to break the world into quadrants. And so there are 4 quadrants here. Techniques, tools, platforms, and languages and frameworks. We have 4 rings here: hold, assess, trial, and adopt. And I'll give you the technical definitions of what we mean by those rings in just a second. And these are all technologies that are scattered on this landscape. And you'll notice that some of these are triangles and some of them are circles. The iconography also has some meaning as well. The rest of this document takes each of these quadrants in turn and splits it out, adds some additional iconography, including some history and some other things like that, but more importantly provides a 2 or 3 sentence write-up about each one of these technologies, why it's here, why it's in the ring that it's in, are there other technologies related to this one that are similar, that have similar characteristics, etc. And that's the remainder of this, or pages and pages, of about 10 pages usually, a couple of pages for each one of those quadrants. And then at the very end, we have resources, references, and other stuff like that, who we are, and references to the things we talked about there in our radar. We also have an interactive version. If you go to thoughtworks.com/radar, you get the latest version of the interactive radar, and it acts the same way. If you click on one of the links, it'll show you which that link is. If you click on it, in turn, it will give you the 2 or 3 sentence description that describes it. And if you want more information about this blip, you can click there, and you'll see the entire history of this blip, when it showed up on our radar, and all of the things that we've said about it for its entire life cycle. One of the questions that we get asked quite often is, I'm deeply in love with technology X, and I notice that technology X doesn't show up on your radar. What's the deal? Do you not love it as well? Well, we're trying to stay really true to this radar metaphor, so we're only trying to comment about things that are in the very near future. So there are lots of technologies that we've made comments on in the past that just don't show up on our radar anymore because they're not something that's brand new. If you're curious to see if something that you love has ever been on our radar, you can go to this interactive radar, and there's an A to Z link there that has the entire history of everything that's ever been there. So you can search there and see where it was, what its fate was. Very often things that we love dearly, like Git, for example, move into this adopt circle, but then there's a rule that says it fades away if it hasn't moved out of that circle. And so, but you can see its full history there. Let me give you a little bit of background as to how this came about, because this was not some sort of strategic thing that we figured out. It kind of evolved and grew like a weed. ThoughtWorks is the company I work for. We're an international consultancy in about 15 countries now and about 3,000 people worldwide. And we have a CTO who's responsible for all of the Chief Technology Officer things at ThoughtWorks. But we also try to be really proactive about technology choices as a company, and we like to advise people with authority about technology decisions. So for example, we were really early proponents of Ruby on Rails in the enterprise, which sounded kind of sketchy, but we understood the technical characteristics of Ruby on Rails and where it would fit for certain problems. And she's the ultimate arbiter of those things for ThoughtWorks, but she's only one person and she's got a really busy day job as being the CTO. And so she created as part of her role this group of people called the Technology Advisory Board. This is about 2 people from each region, so this is about 30 people now. And it is a virtual body. We meet via a hideously timed international phone call every 2 weeks. I actually dodged a bullet because I'm in London this week and the call was yesterday, so it was noon, which is nice. It's 5 a.m. or midnight in Sydney, which really sucks for them, and it's usually 5 a.m. or midnight in San Francisco, which really sucks for them too. But we also meet face-to-face twice a year. We just had our last face-to-face meeting within the last month also here in London. And when we get together face-to-face, we talk about all things tech at ThoughtWorks, like how to hire good people and how to retain people. And we have coding problems as part of our hiring exercise, so we vetted those. But it's also inevitable when you get a whole bunch of technologists together who see each other only infrequently that this is going to degenerate at some point into kind of a partial geek fest. Because somebody from Australia will say, oh, you got to see this cool thing we're doing in this project here, and then somebody from Germany will say, oh, we're doing this other cool thing. And so at some point we decided we should formalize that because everybody enjoyed that discussion so much. And so we formalized that discussion as part of the tab, and then we started inviting people that were in whatever office we were in to kind of join that discussion. And my colleague Darren Smith, who was on the tab at the time, came up with this radar metaphor, and we started publishing it internally, and then we started publishing it externally, and much to our surprise, it has become quite a popular publication. Now when we release one of these things, we get hundreds of thousands of hits on our website, and there's marketing events planned around it, and all this stuff, completely unintentional, because all we're really trying to do here is capture our opinion about what technologies we like and that are effective about solving problems. And this metaphor that we created went kind of viral. This is InfoQ from 2012 during their conference. They posted this interactive radar thing. They changed one of our labels from whole to hype, but it's basically this exact same metaphor. And I think one of the reasons why this metaphor has become kind of popular, I don't think it's a perfect metaphor for capturing this stuff, but it's a way to capture this information in a relatively concise form. And I think nature abhors a vacuum for metaphorical things, metaphorical frameworks like this. And so I think this is a handy way to express some ideas like this. It's actually a very deep metaphor, and I'll get into that a little bit later. My colleague Darren Smith has this kind of weird, uncanny ability to come up with these really surprisingly deep metaphors. I'll dig into that in just a second. But it's important to understand what our radar is because yours is going to be slightly different. So ours is a snapshot in time by opinionated technologists. It is not expected to be comprehensive. We don't expect that we know everything about the breadth and depth of the technology world. We only talk about things that we have direct experience with. It's not a technology lifecycle assessment tool. All this is really tracking is adoption. Once you've adopted something, we don't really care. And I'll show you how that manifests as I dissect this metaphor a little bit more. And the other reason I think it's kind of popular is because of this reason. From a ThoughtWorks standpoint, it's not particularly strategic because we say bad things about technologies in public, and most consulting companies, the adults who run the consulting company won't let the technologists do that because it limits the kind of markets you can work in if you've been bad-mouthing technologies in public. But our opinion as technologists within ThoughtWorks, if we say something bad about a hideously crappy technology and it just ensures that we never have to work in that technology, then hey, that's a bonus for us. That's good. We've got no complaints with that, and so in some ways the inmates are running the asylum from a technology standpoint. But we also try to be objective and honest, and I think people like that because it's hard to find objective, honest things out in the world. So like I said, the purpose of this thing is different from a ThoughtWorks standpoint than for yours, because when you build a radar, you're not trying to build a snapshot in time to project out in the world to tell people what you like. Rather, you're using this as kind of an analysis tool. For yourself, it's more of a strategic career planning thing, and for your company, it's really a way of creating a feedback loop. And I'll get into that in just a second. But before I do that, let me talk about the mechanics of how the moving parts of this radar thing works. And let me talk about what the rings mean on our radar. So the outermost ring on our radar is hold, and that means that any technology that shows up in that ring, we're trying to say here, proceed with caution. Basically that you shouldn't start anything new with this technology because it is flawed in some fundamental way. We do not have an avoid category on our radar, and this is something that Rebecca insisted early on, and we've since come to view this as great wisdom in hindsight, because we really want to be true to this radar metaphor, and we want to be relentlessly forward-looking. So this is about new technologies that are coming towards you right now, and having a avoid category on here makes it very easy for this radar exercise to degenerate into kind of a recriminations of all the terrible technology decisions that have been made in the past. And while that's a fun exercise, it's not particularly constructive. We're trying to make this thing be a tool to be more constructive. And we're also pragmatists. We realize that if we say, oh, you should put this on hold, you can't stop using it right away, but you can not build new things on top of it. So that's basically what we're saying when we say we want to put something on hold. All the rest of the rings are positive assessments. The next one in is assess. These are technologies that are worth doing more research and development on. When you first hear about them, they sound quite interesting. Sounds like it may have a unique solution to a problem you're having, and so it's worth doing some more research and development on it. The next circle in from there is trial. This suggests that you've done some research and development on it and you've assessed it, that it's worth pursuing, that it solves a problem in some novel or better way. It's important to understand how to build up this capability and maybe start building some best practices around how this thing works. Maybe this is the point where you try it on a low-risk project. We wanted a kind of objective criteria for ourselves to move something from assess to trial, and we only move things on our radar from assess to trial if we've actually used it on a project to solve a problem. We're firm believers that you can't really understand a technology thoroughly until you've used it in its natural setting to solve problems, and so that's our criteria. Even insanely promising things, we will keep in assess until we've vetted them by moving them to trial. In the early days of Scala and Clojure, they were both in assess, and we ended up getting a Scala project before Clojure, which drove us crazy, the ones of us that love Clojure, so that just made us double down and get a project in Clojure to make sure that the promise that seemed like it was there is in fact reflected by the technology. And then finally, the innermost circle on our radar is adopt. When we put something in our adopt circle, that means that the industry has finished trial on this. We have good best practices for usage. This is kind of our no-brainer category. You should absolutely be using this technology, whatever it is. One of my colleagues who's on the tab, who's the head of technology in North America, is Mike Mason, and he came up with a criteria that we call Mason's razor. And let's say that you're using some hideously inappropriate technology at work when there's a much better, probably open source technology that would solve this problem. We won't really give you grief about it while we're working with you at the office in our role as consultants, but when we go to the pub later for drinks, we will make fun of you for using this hideously broken technology. So if you're still using something awful and broken like ClearCase instead of something that's clearly better like Subversion or Git, we won't make fun of you at work, but when we go to the pub later for drinks, we will make fun of you for still using something that is both expensive and horrible. So let's talk about the shapes on our radar. As you notice, when we blow up the quadrants, we have added iconography on here. Part of this has to do with the initial origin of this thing as a white paper. We wanted to give some sense of context for one radar back. Because again, true to this radar metaphor, those blips fade when they go, but they fade slowly, so you still see that context for a little while. And so when you look at the blown up quadrants on our radar, triangles mean they're brand new on this radar, and circles mean they're not new, so they've been here at least one radar before. The little shadow shows its position on the last radar, and the little vector shows movement. We also have this concept of category. This used to be a single blip on our radar called distributed version control systems, and then we wanted to start tracking individual technologies independently of one another, so that little star indicates that that blip burst and became individual technologies like Mercurial and Git in this case. Then we also have this concept that we call things passing through the center. So here's the rule. So ThoughtWorks clearly uses a lot of technologies. Actually, one of the reasons that we produce this radar is we're kind of uniquely qualified to assess a big, huge swath of technologies because we have 200 software projects going worldwide, and so we have a kind of an interesting breadth to see things. So we use a lot of technologies, and if everything we used all the time were in adopt, it'd be very easy to lay out our radar because it would be a solid blue mass and you'd never be able to see anything in there. And so to avoid that problem from happening, we have this aging rule that says any blip that hasn't moved in 2 radars automatically fades away. And so what frequently happens for things that have really nice characteristics, like for example a get, is they pop up and assess, and then they move into trial, and then they move eventually into adopt, and then they sit there for 2 radars, and then they automatically fade away. And that technology may not ever show up again on our radar. This is why I say this is not a technology life cycle assessment tool, because once you've adopted it, we lose interest in it. Now it's yours. It might eventually show up and hold if we've come up with a better alternative for it. So let me give you an example of how this might play out with some popular technologies out there. Let's say that we're back, let's say we were doing these radars back in the early 90s. CVS would be an adopt because it's the clear winner in the open source version control. And then Subversion pops up and it's very promising. It moves through assess and trial, ends up in adopt. And CVS ends up in hold. You shouldn't use it anymore. So Subversion fades in adopt. And then a few years later, Git comes along and moves in here and hits adopt. Now we haven't said hold on Subversion yet, but we're getting close because Git is clearly a really nice piece of technology. So that's the kind of natural technology life cycle and the way things work on our radar. It is possible for things to move backwards. This is an interesting case, this guy. This is a 2010 radar, and I don't think it's on our radar now, but Intentional Software is this company in Seattle. There's this really interesting vision. We keep getting enamored by the vision, and then we see the implementation, and it's kind of disappointing. So it keeps moving from assess to hold and assess to hold. So it's been dancing back and forth across that line for a while. Questions about any of this blip stuff, and rings, or any of those things? So here are the aging rules. Yeah, question?
Right, just a couple. So those sort of relative movements, are they within the rings? Are they sort of arbitrary? Are they based on sort of further discussion?
Yep, it's a good question. It's not, we don't really obsess within the rings about exact positioning. So if something is 3 millimeters closer, we're not trying to make an editorial statement there. We're just trying to get the labels not to overlap very often. We will put things right on the border if we think something's right on the edge of assess or trial. So there's a little bit of coarseness, but we're not.
Edge of the ring, the middle of the ring.
Yeah, we're not trying to be super subtle on that. Although,
does the sort of 2 radars rule apply to all the rings? Sorry, so if it's in hold for 2, then it fades out.
Yep, if it languishes in any ring for 2 radars, then it fades away. Yep. So we have things that pop up in trial. Well, very often we'll have things pop up in assess, and they don't play out, and they'll fade off of a radar and disappear. In fact, some things fade off after 1 radar because they don't play out in the way that we thought they might. So our aging rules, blips age off after 2 radars with no movement. Unless we re-blip them for a reason, we will occasionally re-blip something on purpose. Very often those are things that we re-blip and hold because we want to make a definitive statement that we really, really don't like this, whatever it is. And that's almost always because we're offering an alternative. Mason's second law says be careful of moving things straight to adopt because I've seen some brand new technology has just shown up and it's instantly a no-brainer. Excuse me, and that's a very rare thing. Excuse me, like I said, hold items are almost never for spite. They're there because we're trying to suggest some sort of alternative, unless it's just an awful, awful thing. There's a...
Do you ever get pressure from suppliers of these new technologies to get them on your radar?
Oh, yes. Rebecca gets all sorts of emails from vendors soliciting, we'd love to be on your radar, but it does not work that way. I'll show you how the nomination process works. It has to be vetted on a project and come from grassroots before we even consider something. So yeah, we get a lot of requests for that, but none of them are acquiesced to. There's a frequently asked questions at Martin Fowler's site. He's a member of our technology advisory board. And while I'm talking about mechanics, one last topic here before I start talking about encouraging to build your own. If when you build your own radar, you want to create this visualization, someone has already done the hard work for you. You can barely see the lines here, but there are radar lines on this guy. This is something that one of my former colleagues in Australia created. Brett Dargan created this and open sourced it up on GitHub called TechRadar. You basically fill in a JSON data structure and it will draw this radar for you on an HTML5 canvas. So yeah, all the hard work of rendering this thing is done. In fact, the interactive radar, we actually forked this as the first iteration of our interactive radar. So of course, there's a lot of augmentation. We're eventually going to open source our thing. In fact, we had a discussion about it yesterday on the tab call. Not sure when that's going to happen, but this is out there. On Brett's tool, he will allow you to do precise placement within those rings. Never let it be said that this might not be just a teeny bit over-engineered, because the way that he does that, this is the JSON data structures, you have to put everything in polar coordinates, which is a little bit of a yak shave to figure out how to get the polar coordinates to work, but that does give you exact, precise placements of the blips within the quadrant. So this is the best way to do that without doing some sort of weird XY translation. So this is out there if you want to use this to create your own visualization of this stuff. So that's the ThoughtWorks radar. That's the metaphorical inspiration for the other two. And so we started producing the ThoughtWorks radar in 2010. And then at conferences I was speaking at, I had people start coming up to me and saying, you know, we did this radar exercise for ourselves within a company, and it turned out to be a really good exercise. So we started doing this for some of our clients using the same process that we used. And we realized that this is actually quite a useful tool for a couple of other radars. So let's talk about first the developer radar. And this requires a little more history about me that is not me. Back a long, long time ago, I used to be the CTO for a small training consulting company that did Clipper development. Has anyone here ever seen one of these boxes? Be careful if you say yes, you're going to date yourself. Clipper was this DOS-based technology that was object-based, and there was a library called Classy that would make it completely object-oriented. And we all knew how object-oriented programming worked in the early 90s, so we had created this really nice application framework, and we were building Clipper applications like crazy. We had really good consulting pipeline. We had training classes on how to build Clipper stuff. Everything was fantastic until slam. Then Windows came along, and it was like somebody turned off a faucet. All the Clipper work just evaporated overnight. It made me realize a couple of things as the CTO, because I got blindsided by this. And one is, whether you like it or not, technology keeps marching on. This is relentless. You can't get it to stop. But the other thing that I realized, even more importantly, is that when you're heavily invested in a technology, you're living in a technology bubble. And when that bubble starts collapsing, it's really hard to tell from the inside. And this is even more true if you're using a technology that is a commercial technology that is shepherded by a commercial software company, because when their bubble starts collapsing, they will actively try to prevent you from finding out. Because the more people they can kind of avoid letting know that this bubble is collapsing, the longer people will stick around in that market. This is a particularly dangerous thing for technologists, because you invest maybe 5 or 10 years into a technology, and then all of a sudden it evaporates, and you have to scramble and learn a brand new technology of some kind. What this made me realize is that you really need to manage your technology portfolio, because in a lot of ways, this is like a financial portfolio. In fact, if you get paid for technology, those two things are inextricably entwined with one another. Far too many technologists just use the shiniest thing as their next career goal, but what I'm trying to suggest is you be a lot more strategic about this. Now, if we adhere to this metaphor that your technology portfolio is like a financial portfolio, what's the number one thing your financial portfolio planner tells you about your financial portfolio? Everyone all together now. Diversify, of course. And you want to do the exact same thing in your technology portfolio to avoid getting blindsided in case you get trapped in one of these bubbles. And in fact, it's probably not a bad idea to partition it just like you do your financial stuff. Pick some safe, no-brainer technologies that you know are going to be useful in the near future. And maybe pick a few passion-based, I don't know if this will ever turn into anything, but maybe it turns into the coolest career ever. So what's a good example of a safe, no-brainer kind of technology in 2015, do you think, that you could be invested in and be pretty secure? What do you think? Java is okay, but that's too general, because you can't get a job just as Java. It's Java something. It's Java server-side, or it's Java in the finance industry or something. So, but I think Java is interesting because it is the COBOL of the 21st century. In a good way. It's the way business applications are written very often. And so I think I'm pretty sure that there are Spring configuration files that will outlive everyone in this room. So I think that's a pretty safe, maybe not the most exciting stuff in the world, but pretty safe. Someone said something about Angular. That's pretty good in the short term, but man, I would not want to bet my financial future on JavaScript web frameworks right now. That is just way too wild, wild west for me to invest a crazy amount of time and effort into. I think JavaScript is a really, really smart thing to invest time and effort into because it turns out it is the one true write once, run everywhere language, because the other languages that claim to do that don't run here. Now, even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool server-side programmer and think, I'm never going to have to sully myself with that horrific thing called JavaScript, there are frameworks now that people are developing that allow you to run the same code on your web application and on a variety of different phones. And the ways they do that is write the workflow and business logic in the only code that runs on every single device on earth, which is JavaScript. So even if you're on the server side, you may end up sullying your hands with that nasty JavaScript stuff at some point. There is Jeff Atwood is the coding horror guy on Twitter, and he has what he calls Atwood's Law, which I'm terrified may be true. And Atwood's Law says that everything that can be written in JavaScript will be written in JavaScript. And I see that coming to pass more and more every day, and it's a little bit terrifying, but it's happening. So anything around JavaScript, HTML5, CSS, I think is a pretty safe place. What's another relatively safe, no-brainer technology you think? SQL probably is going to be for a while, but SQL is a tricky thing, though, because you can't get a job just as SQL. It's Oracle DBA or it's SQL Server DBA, and those are good examples of companies that try to bind their employees with technology. Because when you're a Microsoft DBA, for example, SQL Server, you learn a lot of intricate details about SQL Server that are unapplicable anywhere else in the world. So if for some reason that technology bubble died, it would be tougher to move into another place. But that's kind of the game in that space. So you have to kind of pick your poison if you want to invest heavily in the DBA space. As far as far out sci-fi kinds of things, I know a couple of people who started working on open source projects, and then those things became actual products. Charles Nutter was this guy who was a corporate Java developer by day, and he got this crazy idea to see how much of Ruby he could get to run on the JVM. And everybody said, you're crazy, you'll never get that to work, there's too much impedance mismatch. That was Charles Nutter. Now, of course, he works for Red Hat as the international evangelist for JRuby, does nothing but work on JRuby and travel around talking about JRuby. Another guy I know was a corporate Java developer by day, but contributing to the open source web framework that became Grails, and then it became a company, and then it was purchased by Spring, which was purchased by VMware. So he spends his day at home working on this open source framework that he founded. That's the technology equivalent of hitting a really speculative stock and going through the roof. People do this now with mobile apps, things like that. Really what this exercise is designed to do, rather than highlight specific technologies, is to get you to think about what are your ultimate goals in the technology world beyond just the Peter Principle, which is a unique trap waiting for us. This is a concept in management theory back from the 1960s, but it's still true in a lot of organizations. It was exemplified by this book. And the Peter Principle says, in a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his or her level of incompetence. So the way this works is you're doing a great job here, you get promoted, you're doing a great job there. You keep getting promoted until you get promoted into a job that is beyond your capabilities, and then you'll just wither and die in that job. You've been promoted to your highest level of incompetence, so you've gotten as high as you can, do something, and then one past that. This is published in 1969. The way this manifests for a lot of technologists out in the world is this nonsensical statement that you keep hearing over and over. You're such a great coder, you should be a manager somewhere. And there may be two things less correlated on earth than these two things about good developer skills and good management and people skills. And yet in a lot of organizations, this is the career path. Once you hit a certain level, then to keep ascending, you have to switch to some sort of management path. And that may be a good thing for you, but it may not be a good thing. And so this is one of those things you have to plan strategically. If you want to stay hardcore technical, you've got to make sure that a career path exists that allows you to do that and keep ascending in your career. So one of the things you're going to do is you put together a personal radar is assess technologies that you should spend some time learning about. Rather than just kind of picking things up randomly, you can be a lot more strategic about it. I call these things litmus tests. How can you have a collection of tests that you can apply to new technologies as soon as you encounter them to decide, should I spend more time looking at you or not? Now, these are going to be highly personalized things because these are going to be related to personality characteristics like, do you really love new things or do you really hate new things? Or, do you love digging into brand new things, brand new frameworks, or do you prefer digging deep into something and learning it much more broadly and deeply? I'll give you some of my litmus tests, but I'm strongly encouraging you to create some of your own because these are going to be highly tied to your own personality. And the first of these for me has been a really useful one for me. I do a lot of agile software development. I'm really into agile engineering practices, so testability is a really good litmus test for me. When I look at a new technology, I try to assess what is its testing story. So for example, when Flex came out, looked like a promising kind of technology, but the first thing I asked it was, how testable are you? And it was kind of sketchy, it was kind of anemic, and so I said, okay, well, I will wait until Flex either gets a better testing story or it withers and dies, and it died. And so I never spent one extra minute looking at Flex because it failed one of my really fundamental tests. I didn't have to spend any time looking at it because time is at a premium here. Technology keeps expanding rapidly. We're kind of in the place where medicine was around the time of the American Civil War in about the 1850s, where there was doctor. There wasn't surgeon or foot doctor or ear, nose, and throat. There was doctor. And they carried mostly an axe and whiskey. That was their main tools for getting stuff done. So that's about where we are now, or maybe 10 years ago. And medicine greatly specialized. And we're going to see that same level of specialization here. So you got to be able to narrow and pick things. And part of that is these litmus tests, like things like testability. Another litmus test is how well does it integrate with the ecosystem that you already have. One of the things I'm going to suggest is if you can learn new technologies as part of your day job, that means that you short circuit a lot of time you have to spend otherwise, and that's a good win, but it has to integrate with all the stuff that's already there. And so you may want to learn something that's completely out of bounds of what you do as your part of your day job, but you should make sure you do that strategically and not accidentally. Another important aspect of this is learnability. And there are a couple of different things that I can say about this. One is you want to become as effective at learning new things as you possibly can. One of my colleagues a few years ago made the observation, or actually made the speculation, has there ever been a time in history when people have learned so much intricate, detailed knowledge only to flush it away and then 2 years later learn another set of really detailed, intricate knowledge and then flush that and then learn another detailed set? Probably at some point, but we're certainly on the bleeding edge of that. So the suggestion here is, notice that when you signed up for a technology career, you inadvertently signed up for a lifelong course in continuing education. You are sitting in an almost windowless room on a Friday afternoon. It's a Thursday afternoon, so there's part of my evidence for that. So you want to be as efficient as possible on this. So one of the ways to be efficient at this, if you're trying to learn some new complex technology, is create a little social group around it. Create a brown bag lunch, say every Wednesday let's meet for lunch and we'll all learn Scala, we'll all learn Clojure or JavaScript or something like that. Having a group gives you a little bit of social pressure to keep up with what's going on. It also, when very complex things come up, it gives you multiple brains to try to figure out what those are. It's very easy to get trapped and spin your wheels if you're trying to learn something by yourself, but when you're in a group, it's a little easier to apply multiple minds to that problem. The other thing that I would suggest you can do as much as possible is try to use new technologies and incorporate them into your day job. Even if you're in a really conservative organization, they often have leeway in developer tool space. So let me give you an example that I commonly give people in this space. If you're in the Java ecosystem, I would say stop writing unit tests for Java in Java. Because Java was never meant to be particularly unit testable, and it's very cumbersome to do some common things. There's a scripting language called Groovy that is basically Java syntax, but a modernized version. You can still subclass from the same things in the Java ecosystem, like the same core testing frameworks. But Groovy automatically has things like mocking and stubbing built in. Groovy also very conveniently ignores the private modifier, so you can do test-driven development on private methods in Java without having to do a bunch of crazy reflection and stuff like that. The advantage of doing that is you're using a sharper tool, which means you're getting stuff done faster, but you're using a more advanced language as well, which means you have the ability to learn about functional programming and meta-object protocol and meta-programming and things like that as part of your day job. And the more new stuff you can learn as part of your day job, you don't have to do it at the expense of your life, which you're probably trying to maximize and not figuring out ways to spend more of it trying to learn new technology stuff.
Might just lead to a bit of a mess, though. I mean, say I adopt that policy, someone else sticks with a traditional policy, someone else finds some other new crazy testing framework that they want to use in Java. You know, you've just got a total, you know, you're encouraging a total.
Well, I'm not suggesting chaos. What I'm suggesting is all the developers get together and say, look, we're using a blunt tool and swinging it like cavemen. Let's get a sharper tool and use it as a group. So I'm not suggesting you go off on your own and do this. I'm suggesting you actually get everybody on your team to do this. Unless you want to just look a lot better than your colleagues, because you're a lot faster. Well, this should be a group effort, I think. Another great way to assess new technologies and get them into the assess ring on your radar are external references. Conferences are the obvious place to do this because this will let you short circuit a lot of that assess phase. You could hear someone present about something and ask them questions and learn stuff more quickly that way. Even if you don't go to conferences, you can still use this as a resource. Pretty much every conference on earth now puts their agenda online, and so if you're very plugged into the Java ecosystem, you could take a rainy Sunday and go visit all the Java conferences on earth and find out what people are talking about that's on the cutting edge in the Java world, and that's a good source of things that you probably want to look at in the near future. You can also do this trick of finding authors who have the same taste that you do or have discovered interesting things in the past. This is a book by Glenn Vanderberg that was published in almost 900 pages and published less than a year after Java came out. So this is the first advanced Java book. He had a kind of a crystal ball because when Java came out, it was not a foregone conclusion that it was going to be a super popular thing. But Glenn had kind of a crystal ball there. And so I still follow Glenn on social media to see what he's interested in these days. And that's similar to when you find a movie critic that likes the same kind of movies you do and you start going to them to find out, well, I like this movie or not. Do the exact same for people on your social network and leverage their opinions about things, and that will short circuit your assess phase, the theory being if they like it, then you'll probably like it as well. There are language guides out in the world like Tiobe that professes to tell you the relative popularity of languages out in the world. This is a fine guide, but make sure you know where they get their source data from. Tiobe in particular does a lot of slurping of news groups and looks for news group subjects and comments. And so the side effect of that is, let's say I've just come out with a new version of RPG for the OS 400 and it's the worst release ever. And so the news groups light up about how much I hate this release, and it will rise in popularity on Tiobe. Because this is just looks at mentions, not positive or negative mentions. And so take these with a grain of salt or at least know where their source data comes from. Speaking of using social networks, there's an interesting perspective on this in this book, Enterprise 2.0 by Andrew McAfee. That's a good way to vet technology stuff. So here's the way he talks about this. So he says that you have three different social links that exist. Strong links are people that you see all the time. These are family members, these are coworkers, these are people that are neighbors in your neighborhood. He says that kind of the defining characteristic here is the people that are in your strong links, you can tell me what they had for lunch at least one day last week. So you see them on a really regular basis. Outside your strong links are weak links. These are people that you see only semi-regularly, maybe a couple of times a year. The way that before we had things like Facebook and Twitter, the main exemplar of this was, I don't know if this is common here, but the crazy Christmas letter from Uncle Bob and his family once a year. Uncle Bob, who you never see, sends you this lengthy narrative about the crazy adventures of his family over the last year. That's a good example of a weak link. And then outside of that are potential links, which are going to be either strong or weak links, or just people you haven't met yet. Andrew McAfee's point about this is that your next job is more likely to come from your weak links than your strong links. Because your strong links know all the stuff you do. So you get no surprises from your strong links. You get surprises from your weak links. The next very interesting technology stuff is more likely to come in through weak links than from strong links, because strong links, the people you see at work all the time, know all the basic same technology stuff you do. So the advice here is to find, and Twitter I think is particularly well suited to this, even if you're not a big Twitter user anyway, create a little Twitter account and find a handful of technologists who you find very interesting, who have the same taste in technology you do, and start following them, and they will start giving you interesting things that you can start assessing as part of your radar without you having to filter the entirety of the entire world. Let your social network do some of that filtering for you. So that's a way to leverage tools like Twitter to actually start feeding you new things that you can start assessing as part of your technology radar. Another big litmus test for me is narrow suitability to task. I much prefer a la carte things to big comprehensive things. And in fact, that's a nice segue into how do you choose technology anyway when you start to choose a new technology to do something. One of the things that's important to do is to understand industry trends around whatever technology you're looking at. And there are some clear industry trends you can kind of see. So for example, in the JavaScript world, a few years ago, the fashion were big comprehensive frameworks that did a lot of stuff for you. Now, very much is in fashion is this kind of a la carte mix and match where you get Phantom and Mustache and Batman and handlebars and all these things and mix and match them together to build applications. 5 years ago, all the rage in integration architectures were things like service-oriented architecture and enterprise service buses. Now all the rage is in microservice architectures, which in some ways are the opposite of what we did in those worlds. Same is true in web frameworks. For a while, web frameworks are these big comprehensive things like Rails and Grails and MVC. Now we see much smaller kinds of web frameworks like Sinatra. These little almost just routing frameworks, and you build a la carte behavior on top of them. The point of this is that there are definite technology trends in the industry, and you'd better have a good reason for bucking those trends. So if you were picking a new technology that was Flash-based now rather than HTML5 video-based, you'd better have a really good justifiable reason for picking that, because clearly the industry trend is away from those kind of embedded binaries and toward the HTML5 standards. Another important thing to do is to normalize feature sets. A great quote by Rich Hickey that I actually use in a workshop that I do about software architecture is that developers understand the benefits of everything and the trade-offs of nothing. Developers get very excited about new frameworks and new tools, and they want to use them for everything, but you need to temper that with a little bit of justification to make sure that it's the right choice. This is actually one of the tricky things about being this transition from developer to architect, is you just have to start thinking a lot more about the trade-offs that you're going to have to incur when you look at technologies. And that's this idea of normalizing feature sets. One of the really nice things that commercial technologies all have on the side of the box is a feature matrix explaining why all of its competitors are clearly inferior to this product, whatever it is. You can do this for your own assessment, build your own feature matrix, and include the good, the bad, and the ugly. So for example, let's say that a developer comes to you and you're a decision maker and they say, I've found Bob's web framework and this is awesome. We should use this for everything on our projects. Now when you go to Bob's web framework, probably an open source project, it's going to extol all the virtues on the homepage of all the awesome things it does. But you can't scroll down to the bottom and see a little asterisk that says, oh, by the way, Bob's framework sucks at 3 things you desperately need to do as part of your application. Because they're always marketing to you. And so that's why you need to build your own feature matrix. Say, okay, we can assess this technology. What are all the things we're going to need this technology for? You can fill in some of those boxes just by doing research, but a few of these you're going to have to actually build little projects to understand, will Bob's framework play nice with the authentication authorization framework that's currently in use in my company right now? That's something you need to know before you go wholesale adoption on this. So a lot of choosing new technologies is assessing suitability for how well it's going to fit in with other things. The way that we tend to do this in the agile engineering world is this practice called spikes. These are time box experimental coding exercises. So a good example of a spike is we're assessing Bob's new web framework and we need to find out if it works, plays nice with the authentication and authorization mechanism we have in our company. You'll start a little tiny project as a branch off your main branch, and you just build code until you verify, yay or nay, that this works the way I think it does. You do this in a time box so you don't get this spinning out of control. This is pure knowledge acquisition about a single thing. Don't try to do a spike to learn 5 things at one time. You're better off doing 5 little tiny time box spikes. These are not prototypes. These do not grow into real things because you're moving as quickly as possible when you do a spike. The real goal here is as fast as possible, so you're not going to do test-driven development. You're not going to create good names for classes and properly formatted methods and comments and all that stuff. You're sprinting as fast as possible. The goal is you develop this on a dead-end branch, you use the things you learn to build proper code in the trunk of your project, but don't stress about making this a prototype. This is just sprinting as fast as you can to learn something, maybe to fill out the things on a feature matrix that you're trying to decide, will this actually work in my ecosystem or not. And the last piece of advice here, especially when you're doing a company radar, is try to avoid what I call the suck-rock dichotomy. It seems like everything in the technology world either rocks or it sucks, and there's no middle ground between those things. Part of this is that groups of developers, like simple primates, love to get together and chuck things at one another as groups. Another part of this, though, I think, is that you spend a non-trivial amount of time learning a new technology, and the last thing you want to hear is to say, oh, I spent 2 years learning this cool new thing, and somebody said, oh, you wasted your time, you should have learned so-and-so. Your first instinct is to say, oh, yeah, well, you suck, and I rock. So you should try to avoid that, particularly when you're doing a mixed technology discussion in a group of people. That can get in the way. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about building a company radar, and I actually wrote this up on my blog as the suck-rock dichotomy. When you build a new radar or build a radar for yourself, a personal radar, you can use our quadrants, techniques, tools, platforms, and languages, but don't be constrained by that. You may have a specialized quadrant if you're in a specific domain, like you're in financial services and there are a bunch of financial service package software that you want to assess as part of your radar. Doesn't even have to just be 4 quadrants. It can be as many of these as you want, but don't feel constrained by looking at this. We're just trying to partition the technology world in a generic way. So building a developer radar is kind of a no-brainer. This is really just an exercise in being more strategic about your career planning. It's a way to capture some of this stuff in a semi-permanent format. This lets you proactively guard your career. This is not a bad thing to do every year or so, just kind of as a safety check on your technology stuff. I do this every December because December kind of slows down anyway, and this is a good time to kind of refresh the kinds of things you want to spend time on from a technology standpoint. Questions about individual radar stuff? So let's talk about the third one, which is probably the least anticipated but most valuable of the 3 of these. Let's talk about the company radar, and I'm going to dig deeper into this metaphor for a second, because this is the right place to talk about this metaphor. So one of the interesting things about a radar is temporality. When you see a blip, that blip fades away and then it'll eventually come back. But you see it takes a little time to fade away, and as things move, they fade away. So we wanted to capture some of that temporality in our radar. And really this is how this metaphor was developed. So when you look at the typical adoption curve, Gartner or somebody came up with this, for any kind of technology, you have innovators, you have early adopters, and then the early majority, the late majority, and then laggards. And for any technology inside your organization, there's an ideal place on this curve for you to be that balances risk versus reward. For example, if you're in financial services in Manhattan, you probably need to be an innovator for things like concurrency, ACA, closure, highly concurrent solutions, because that's an important part of your business domain. But if you're a big Giants insurance company, you don't care about concurrency, you really need to be an innovator in big data, and you can afford to be a laggard on things like concurrency. In fact, it's more strategic for you to be a laggard on cutting edge technologies in places that are not going to have a direct effect on your business. The point of this is that for every single technology, you could do an analysis and say, okay, this is the perfect place for us to be on this curve. The problem is you have to draw a lot of curves because you have hundreds or thousands of technologies in an organization. So our radar, in a way, is a way of capturing a whole bunch of these technology curves together at a point in time. So let's change the perspective on this for a second. First, I want to get rid of all the things that happens past this adoption stuff, because we don't really care about that on our radar. We really only care what the ultimate end goal was. Did you adopt it or did it get put on hold? And so if you overlay our categories here, this is very close to some of the things that we have on our radar: assess, trial, and adopt. And then the ultimate end goal of this are things like we either faded it because we didn't use it at all, we faded in and adopt because we adopted it, or we ended up putting it on hold because we don't use it anymore. You can think of our radar as a bunch of these things overlaid on top of one another. So if you look at our categories and look at all these technology adoption cycles for each of those technologies, think of this kind of as a tunnel in time. What our radar is taking all these adoption curves with each other, laid against our radar, and then we cut this tunnel and then rotate it, and that's that radar visualization. It is a snapshot in time of where those adoption curves are for each of those technologies in one two-dimensional display. So the goal here is in one two-dimensional display, you can capture the adoption curves of a whole bunch of different technologies, because you're basically capturing one snapshot, one slice of that tunnel in time as this radar visualization. This is what my colleague Darren Smith came up with, and that's really the deep part of this radar metaphor. So really what this means from a company standpoint is this gives you a tool now that lets you balance risk versus adoption from an IT standpoint. So this can become a business tool that lets you help decide, are we being aggressive enough in this area or too aggressive in this area? Once you start doing that, this can become a platform for doing this analysis over and over again. As you get better and better at assessing technologies, you'll get, or as you do this more and more, you'll get better and better at assessing technologies over time. But now we're getting into the really valuable pieces of this exercise, because it's quite rare in large companies when you have a decision maker or a group of decision makers, maybe you have a group of enterprise architects or you have a CTO, someone who makes decisions about technologies. It is quite rare for that decision maker to gather all the technologists together that are affected by their decisions and ask them pointed questions about whether they like those technologies or not. And one of the reasons this almost never happens is that manager types hate it when their underlings call them stupid. So they almost never give you an opportunity to do that. But that's not good, because sometimes you inadvertently do stupid things. It would be really nice if you had a non-confrontational feedback loop that would let you know how well are you doing in terms of buying technologies that people like consuming. That's the purpose of this company-wide radar. This creates a document that is prepared by the practitioners of technology, but designed to be consumed by the deciders of technology, whether that's a single person or group of people. This is the attempt to create an objective assessment of how well the technology we're using on a daily basis are doing in solving our problems, and should we be investigating other stuff. So this radar, from a company standpoint, is a unified message to non-technical but interested people about the assessment of how we're consuming technology. So that's one really valuable thing. But here's the most valuable thing by far when we've done this exercise with companies, is that these guys need a forum, but they also need a good excuse to get together and have impassioned conversations about technology. So you think that you know what the head of operations thinks about puppet versus chef. You know in your heart of hearts, but when you do this radar session as a group, you actually find out what the head of operations thinks about puppet versus chef. There are all these implicit assumptions you have about other technology parts of your organization that are really kind of weak links to your strong group of people that you see all the time, but most of those assumptions are incorrect. What this really forces is getting all the technologists in the company together, not just the ones that hang out together all the time and have deep conversations about technology. It is always illuminating, and it is always the most valuable part of this exercise, is to get everybody to talk about technology when they normally don't. The last reasons you want to do this is this helps you align business and IT views on technology. Clearly you want those things to be aligned, but maybe the business decides to merge with another company and their IT is kind of a train wreck and you have to absorb that. This helps you keep those things aligned to make sure that the business is doing things that make sense from a technology standpoint and vice versa. So let's talk about how to build one of these things as a group of people. And this is how we do this at ThoughtWorks, and you're going to follow a very similar process. So when we do our radar exercise, first thing we do is take each quadrant in turn. So for each quadrant, what we do for ThoughtWorks is, so I'm from Atlanta in the US, and we have several projects going on in Atlanta. And so before we have the face-to-face meeting, I'll have informal meetings with projects, and they'll tell me things that they're using that they really like and the reasons they really like them. So I will come equipped with a handful of technologies that will get nominated on the radar. Everybody will have done that within their region with more or less degrees of formality. And so when we show up for this radar exercise, first thing we do is for a particular quadrant, we brainstorm for about 20 minutes and everybody writes nominations down on sticky notes and we post them up on a whiteboard. We put a whiteboard and draw 3 lines on the whiteboard, which represents the 4 quadrants on our radar. You put technologies on sticky notes and stick them up on the whiteboard. The moderator then goes up there and clusters like things together because, you know, we're all technologists, we all touch stuff. So for example, chef is going to show up there multiple times or something like console will show up multiple times. So we cluster those things together. And then for each one of these quadrants, we discuss that technology. Should it be on our radar? Which ring should it be in? All those things and decide should it be there or not. We also assign a champion for that blip. That's the person who's responsible for doing the 2 or 3 sentence write-up for us. That shows up on our radar. When you do this for your company, we encourage you to write a full paragraph. And the goal of that write-up is to capture kind of the essence of the conversation that was had around that blip. You're not trying to get a transcript of it, but what that write-up does for you is give you context. In a year, when you look at this radar, you're going to say, now, why was backbone in assess and not in trial? Having that paragraph of write-up will remind you, oh yeah, we talked about that. We talked about that project. I tried it. Oh yeah, so that context is really, really important. We don't do the write-ups in line like this. We typically do that offline because we're doing these meetings face-to-face. And that can frequently be done offline. When we do this for a company, we tend to budget 2 full days to do this. To do 4 quadrants worth of radar. These conversations can take a while, so you probably don't want to tie people up more than that. So we typically do the write-ups asynchronously, but we try to make sure that those get done on a timely basis, otherwise this will just stretch on forever. When you do this for your company, you can certainly feel free to use the quadrants that we came up with, techniques, tools, platforms, and languages, but we frequently change this when we're doing a radar for a company. For example, very often we'll move tools and languages and frameworks up to tools, and a good example of a common addition when we do this for a company is try to assess package or commercial off-the-shelf software. This is something companies have to deal with, but individuals don't have to worry too much about. So companies and CTOs and decision makers have litmus tests too, but they're very different from the litmus tests that developers tend to have when they think about technologies. One of the first things that CTOs care about is licensing and cost. Even free technologies have a cost to your organization, because even if you decide we're going whole hog on Angular, well, there's still training classes and all that other stuff. Even if the technology is free, consuming the technology always costs some money. This is something that CTOs and decision makers still miss all the time, that assessing the availability of resources is more important than the intrinsic technical capabilities of the people that we hire. We have known for a long time now that a few really good software developers can run rings around dozens of average software developers, but hiring people still have not figured that out. We're slowly starting to figure that out a little bit. This is a great book, actually, if you haven't seen this, Mythical Man Month by Fred Brooks, which was written in 1975. This is the book that defines the no silver bullet principle. He actually identified in 1975 the optimum size for a software development team is between 8 and 12 people. Because when you get more than that, then the communication overhead between the individuals becomes more than half the time you spend. You're not writing software, you're trying to communicate about the software you're writing. Amazon and several other companies have kind of adopted this finally 30 years in, and they call these two pizza teams. There's no software development team in Amazon larger that can be fed with 2 large pizzas, which is about 12 people. And so companies are finally coming around to this idea that very small, cross-functional, highly empowered teams are really good, but that's something that most companies still haven't quite figured out. Something that I think CTOs should be concerned about are things like competitive blindside from a technology standpoint. And there's one really looming one on the horizon here that a lot of companies are going to get blindsided by. One of the metrics that we track in the continuous delivery world is this metric called cycle time. A cycle time is a measure of engineering efficiency. It is basically the amount of time that elapses from when you start working on a new problem in software until it shows up, your users can consume it. And the overarching goal of continuous delivery is to make cycle time shorter and shorter and shorter. So it's not uncommon for us where we have stories where we have a client who's on a 6-week release cycle, just a regular scheduled 6-week release cycle. With just a little bit of work with them, we got their cycle time down to about 92 minutes. So they can put something new out live in 92 minutes, which means if their competitors are still on 6-week cycle time, then now our client can start running rings around them for doing marketing and other sorts of things that require agility. There's a great quote by the science fiction author William Gibson who says, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." And there's a great example of that happened within the last year. There were elections in India. It's the largest electorate in the world, like 750 million people, and it's also intensely rural in places. So one of the candidates did campaign appearances via a hologram. And one of the things the hologram was promising people was indoor plumbing. And that's when you know the future is already here. It's just not evenly distributed when the hologram promises you indoor plumbing. But this is exactly true for a lot of companies because a lot of companies look at things like cycle time, they go, why would I care so much about engineering efficiency? Because software is just overhead. It's just like the heating and air conditioning system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time and money in making that more efficient because everybody seems pretty comfortable now, and then they get blindsided because all of a sudden a company comes into their space that does care deeply about things like market agility, and all of a sudden you're in an innovator's dilemma and you get blindsided from a competitive standpoint. It's important to understand these technology things and not get blindsided by them. And I'll tell you one last story about this. This is Paul Graham's story from his book, Hackers and Painters. It's about the first millions he made. Paul Graham, of course, runs Y Combinator, the startup fund in the Bay Area. But he made his first millions by building the very first build-your-own e-commerce website. It's called ViaWeb. He and a very small group of developers got together using Lisp and built basically a domain-specific language for building your own website. So they got very meta. And all their competitors were coding in things like C and Perl. And Paul Graham says that he always looked at his competitors' want ads when he ran ViaWeb. And if he saw them hiring C or Perl programmers, he didn't worry about them. Because the way they'd set their technology stack up, anytime their competitors implemented a new feature, ViaWeb could implement it in just a couple of days. But anytime they implemented a new feature, it took months for their competitors to implement it because they had built a really nice technology solution for this problem. Paul Graham said if he had ever seen anybody hiring Python developers, he would start to get nervous because that's approaching as powerful as Lisp. If he'd seen anyone hiring Lisp developers, he would have gone into a panic because now all of a sudden he has to be as good at business as they are. Now he doesn't have to be nearly as good at business because he can rain blows from above because his technology is so much better. The last thing he wanted was to face them off on an even playing field, and so he always kept a close eye on that. It never happened while he was there, and Yahoo came along and purchased ViaWeb for some untold millions of dollars. And then in the tragic epilogue, Yahoo looked at all this weird Lisp code and couldn't understand it, so they threw it away and rewrote everything in C. Literally the thing that they bought the company for, they didn't understand it when they got their hands on it. And so rather than try to understand why this was the advantage, they threw it away and started out from a really serious disadvantage. All they ended up buying was the name. Of course, the name didn't have any actual intrinsic value to it. That's a good example of not understanding the technology you're consuming. Another one of these anti-patterns that you see for CTOs is that they like integrated tools because they allow fewer choices, but almost never are these things best of breed, or very often do they even play nice with one another. One of the messy realities of the world are things like packaged commercial off-the-shelf software. Don't talk to salespeople if you're a technical person. It's just going to be an exercise in frustration because they will frequently promise things that are outlandish and not at all related to reality. Make sure you have someone technical look at the contract. This is going to sound all too familiar to some of you. We have a client in Vancouver in Canada, and they purchased a piece of packaged software on promise that it will do X. Turns out it won't quite do X, but they'll happily retrofit it for almost $1 million so that it will do X. And then the client did look closely at the contract, and the contract says vendor retains ownership of all this extension code that they wrote. And so they immediately went and sold this new technical capability to all of our clients' competitors. It'll be ready really soon now because we found an angel investor to let us build these new functionality. Of course, that was our client. So make sure you understand the technical aspects of things like, who owns the source code and how that's going to work. Negotiate licenses for things like continuous delivery and engineering practices. Very often they'll be able to negotiate licenses for things like that. And measure technical debt in a particular way. So one of the anti-patterns you see in big companies is that they get a big fire sale by somebody from Oracle or SAP or some big company where if you buy we're crazy here at Oracle this week, if you buy the whole suite of tools, we'll make them a lot less expensive. And we'll just get you in this whole big software stack. And some companies buy that thinking, well, this is good because we'll grow into all that capability later as we need it. The problem with that is all that really is technical debt. Technical debt is stuff that shouldn't be in your code base, but is there in the way of the stuff you're trying to get done. Don't incur technical debt early. Try to put it off as long as possible. And a whole bunch of features in a commercial piece of software that you're not using yet is just going to constantly be in your way and compromise the things that you're trying to work on. I view all those things as technical debt. I think that's the best lens to look at those things through. You also end up a lot of times with the boat anchor anti-pattern, which is every project should use this technology because we spend a lot of money for it, or use this framework because somebody spent a lot of time building this internal web framework, and they spend all their time now maintaining this framework that they built 5 years ago rather than use something open source. That's the boat anchor anti-pattern. This, in case you didn't know about this, is a really nice catalog of all those things you think your company is the only one that's so crazily dysfunctional to do these silly things. This is a catalog for all those things. It's been around for a while, and there are a few of these things. You will recognize many of these things, like the yet another meeting will solve it anti-pattern. You'll see a lot of things that are pretty familiar there, I suspect. So when you build a company radar, from a logistics standpoint, you want to do this in small groups of less than 30 each. Once you get a group larger than about 30 people, it becomes impossible to manage this. You really do want one thread of conversation going at a time as you talk about these technologies. So less than 30 people is probably good, and then you can aggregate the results upwards. We've done this across geographies as well. We had a client who had offices in Hyderabad, Vienna, London, and somewhere in the Midwest, I think Chicago or Indiana. And so we did a radar exercise at each of those locations and aggregated those results into one document. We suggest you go through the exact same exercise that we go through with the sticky notes. It's a really low-tech way to do this, but it captures it really nicely. We generally, when we do this for a company, we tell people who have been assigned a blip that they have 2 weeks to write it up, and we really try to cat herd to make that happen. ThoughtWorks, when we do a radar, capture it in a project tracking tool that has a bunch of workflow and that kind of stuff built into it, but you don't need that for yours. All we do when we do this for a company is just capture that in a spreadsheet. This is what we capture as we're doing the exercise. All you really need to do here is capture which quadrant that you're talking about, and then for each one of those quadrants, which circle you're in, which blip, what the name of the blip is, and who's going to do the write-up. Then people can go in and do the write-up, and hopefully you'll take that and then take this as input to actually build that visualization. You don't have to go that far. Once you capture the actual information, it's here, but if you want to take that extra step and do the visualization, that's a nice thing. We believe that all interested technologists should participate. This shouldn't just be an elite group of decision makers. You really are, for the company radar, trying to harvest information from the leaves of the organization back to the root. And so you really want to get disparate people. As a good example of why this is beneficial, I have a friend who is an application development group for a large insurance company in the US, and they had tried to get Ruby on Rails approved for a while, but the group of very prescriptive enterprise architects had a policy in place that said no one-off exemptions for one technology group, so no luck. So they did a technology radar exercise, and they found out that the marketing department had a skunkworks project going with a bunch of PHP developers, and they wanted to use Cucumber to write behavior tests for that PHP code, and Cucumber requires Ruby. And the project said, oh, two divisions want to use it. Okay, approved. So really what that did was push the awareness up that, yeah, there are actually several people who want to use this technology, maybe in different ways, but it's still a legitimate technology in the organization. So get everyone in the organization who touches technology to participate, because very often beneficial things will come from strange quarters.
Sorry, just a thought there. Would you include people like the external contractors in that?
Absolutely. If they touch technology in your organization, they have an opinion. You want to know what their opinion is too, particularly if you're under contract and you're paying them, because I'll bet they have strong opinions about what they don't like.
Follow-up question about, say,
Oh, you can go ahead and ask me now.
No, it's sort of unrelated.
Okay, sure. Definitely want to do the write-ups. This is the biggest pain in the ass part of this exercise, but this is the context. You'll need it a year to understand why we put blips here. Like I say, when you do this for companies, I recommend people do a paragraph of write-up. You're really trying to capture the essence of the conversation that was had in the room. Not verbatim, but certainly the thrust of it. Depending on how hinky your company is about this kind of stuff, you might consider recording. Everybody has a recorder in their pocket, so for a particular blip, you might record the conversation just so you get a better write-up for it. But some people are kind of hinky about being recorded, so do that carefully. And you should revisit this on a regular basis for Company Radar, maybe once a year or so. We have several clients who are doing this on a regular basis. And make sure you actually take advantage of the results. Don't just do this as an empty exercise and then don't take advantage of those results. Actually utilize them. When you build either radar, either company or personal, the exercise is definitely more important than the artifact. The artifact doesn't have no value, but it is definitely the exercise. It's the thinking process that it forces you through, both the personal radar and the company radar, even though they're slightly different uses. In both cases, this is a way to address strategy over tactics and become more strategic from a technology standpoint, both for yourself and your company. Remember to take advantage of weak social links, as I mentioned before from the Andrew McAfee book. For the company radar and for your own, try to keep an open mind. Maybe some technology you don't know anything about is going to be the thing that changes your life 3 or 4 years from now. That does happen in this world. And for either one of them, you probably want to revisit this on a regular basis. There's another advantage for doing both a personal radar and a company radar. And that is, once you do that, you can capture the delta between those two radars. And that will be an interesting little piece of analysis for yourself, because that will help you understand how aligned is your company with your personal technology goals. Because realize that a radar can be used defensively, but it can also be used offensively. And so maybe you do both of these exercises and realize that there's a serious amount of misalignment there, and maybe this is your motivation for trying to change the giant ship that is your company and get them to adopt new technologies. Maybe you start proselytizing new technologies at brown bag lunches or something like that. Or maybe this is the sad realization that if you can't change your culture, then change your culture. Maybe this is the thing that makes you realize, you know, the company I'm working for doesn't have my long-term technological benefits in mind, and I should start shopping around. This is a crazy fantasy of mine. I don't think it will ever happen, but I think it'd be really cool is if on your next job interview, the very first handshake protocol was you hand them your radar and they hand you their radar, and you kind of overlay them like a transparency to see, should we even continue this conversation, or are we just completely in different worlds and shouldn't even be speaking to one another right now? I don't think that's going to happen, but it would be a really cool way to try to assess just how aligned are we in this world around technology stuff. This whole thing has been written up as a white paper. If you want to download this and spread this around somewhere, and talks about the techniques for doing this in a little more detail. This talk has actually been captured now in 2 parts in the software architecture fundamentals video that I did for O'Reilly, in part 4 in the software architecture soft skills as a way of doing technology assessment. So if you have Safari, you already have access to that out in the world. Questions left over about any of this radar stuff? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I did say this a bit follow-up to the contract question. So, when you're having these discussions with people, you know, with a big group of people, how do you try and take this sort of corporate politics out of that? And I'm sorry for the, so contractors will have their own agenda, a very specific agenda, like they have a contract they want to presumably renew that contract, they have certain skills they want to push those skills, that kind of thing.
Well, I think whoever...
Other managers or, people with decision-making
So
who
if,
have made decisions about particular technologies or architecture.
Sure.
Everyone's got their own agenda.
So whoever the consumer of this radar is should know that that's in place. So they're not going to come blind to this situation. If you're really concerned that they may be giving you unusual information, then I would do separate radars. Do all the contractors do a radar, and then all the employees do a radar, and then do the delta between those and see what's going on. And then maybe in fact, what I would probably do, and this, at least for the initial one, is do one just for employees, one just for contractors, and then a joint one, and then look at the three and see what comes out of that.
I feel there's a scenario where, you have a wide a broad spread of people from technology, and maybe one of those person is quite a senior grade, and they sort of impose their thinking onto the radar. That's sort of...
Well, and so if you're afraid of that happening, then I would do it as a group of senior people and get junior people together and do them as a group so you don't get people. So one of the things that we do a lot of times is we'll make sure that everybody delivers their opinion as a group at the same time. So we do a kind of rock, scissors, paper semantics, boom, boom, boom. Okay, everybody say, should it be on the radar or not? One of the recent innovations we started doing that speeds things up a lot is we give every person a green index card, a yellow index card, and a red one. And basically green means I agree with the general consensus in the room, red means I disagree, and yellow means we should have more discussion. So a lot of times when things come up, they all get a green or red, and you just move on quickly. That may be a way to help that conversation, in the context of that conversation. The ultimate goal here, whatever mechanism by which you achieve this, the ultimate goal here is to try to get as objective an assessment of technologies as possible. And so we'll go to whatever links we take, we'll get that objective assessment. Other questions about this? All right, well then I'll send you home just about 10 minutes early so you can start fighting the tube and that sort of stuff. Thanks very much for coming and hope you enjoyed it.